Welcome to the Razors Inc. podcast with your host, Jonathan Farini. Last week was the Oscars, the annual celebration of the best in motion pictures. But did you notice just how many of this year's nominees got their start on the small screen? Bradley Cooper, Cillian Murphy, America Ferrera, Sterling K. Brown, and others. In many ways, it's a complete reversal of what was happening 60 years ago. So pour yourself a drink, pull up a chair, and hear Jonathan's take on movies, television, and today we'll look back at those who successfully transitioned from film to television. Here's your host, Jonathan Farini.
Welcome to the Razors Inc. podcast. Today's podcast is about the effect of technological change of telling stories, its effect upon the actors. The 1950s rolled around and this thing called television became accessible. In other words, it became affordable where people could go buy a black and white television with antennas. You didn't have cable systems then. You basically had antennas and they would pick up radio waves or airwaves, and for free you could watch television. There were only three networks. The first two were CBS, NBC, and the third was ABC. I had the opportunity actually to meet the founder of ABC back in the 80s. He was a gentleman that got his start owning a string of radio stations. In any event, television comes along, and people now have an alternative to go into the movie theater. Plucking down your money for the tickets, plucking down money for a soft drink and candy and dealing with crowds and this and that. Although going to the movies was still a big thing back then, you now had an alternative. And television sets became affordable. And this is where the podcast becomes interactive, because I'll let you be the judge as to whether television was a positive for these actors I'm going to talk about, or a negative, or it didn't have any effect. So back in the 30s and 40s, we had these movie stars, and I'm going to just be talking about men, but there are a lot of women examples. Barbara Stanwyck, for one, fits into this category. Jane Wyman is another, and I'm leaving a whole population of wonderful female actors out of this discussion, but just let me focus on these men for right now. So back in the 30s and 40s, you had these actors. The first one I want to talk about is a guy named Fred MacMurray. And if you're a film devotee, you're going to know him as a guy that starred in Double Indemnity opposite Barbara Stanwyck, Big Valley television show, very popular, ladies. But Fred MacMurray played a lot of characters in film that were not the nice guy. And he was a very fine bad guy, far more interesting, in my humble opinion, than a good guy. And go back and watch Double Indemnity. Go back and go get a roster of his films. Yeah, there's some films where he's a goofy, love-struck guy. But when television came along, and in particularly the 1960s, Fred MacMurray transitioned into being the star of a very popular television program called My Three Sons. And he's a single father. He's an engineer, pipe-smoking father, soft-spoken, Mr. Nice Guy. And there was another very fine character actor from the 30s and 40s now called William Demarhurst, who played, I think, his Uncle Charlie, and he took care of the three sons. So here's this actor that moves from these noir, these wonderful films, into television, and he did it very successfully with a smile on his face. And I would argue that television was very, very good to him. And I think television was the natural evolution of his career arc. I believe, in my opinion, his finest work was on the film. Let's talk about another one, Raymond Burr, B-U-R-R. Watch him in Rear Window, Hitchcock's Rear Window. He plays a murderer, But prior to that, back in the 40s and the 50s, he played a lot of bad guy roles. And man, he plays them convincingly. He's in the Blue Dahlia, and he takes this woman out for dinner and this drink, and he's just a bad guy. But man, he's got these deep-setted eyes and this square jaw, and he's a very formidable guy. He's built very stocky, and he just plays those roles to the hilt. But by the 50s and the 60s rolled around, he's Perry Mason. But he pulls this television Perry Mason, Earl Stanley Gardner's trial lawyer, off very well, so convincingly. And I think for most people, he's known as Perry Mason. I happened to work in the 80s for the production outfit that was doing a reprise of the Perry Mason series where they were television movies. Another actor, Robert Young, 30s and 40s actor, kind of a leading man on the precipice of a leading man. He also was in some detective stories, noir stories, worked all the time. But by the time the 50s rolled around, he was, this happy-go-lucky father in a television series about a family called Father Knows Best. And it was very popular. By the time the 70s rolled around, he was Marcus Welby, MD. So television was very, very good to him. Television was very, very good to Raymond Burr. And television was very, very good to Fred MacMurray. Talk about another actor you might not be familiar with was a guy named John Forsythe. Again, a 40s movie star. He worked all the time. But in my mind, I don't picture himself so much as a movie star, but as a television star. So he segued from the 40s and 50s into 1950s bachelor father. Again, this was, single guy for whatever reason, has a family that he's taking care of and the ups and downs of that. So, television was really ahead of its time, folks. Single parent families. Give television its due. But by the time the 80s rolled around, you had Dynasty and Charlie's Angels, and that's John Forsythe. And I would argue most people know him for Dynasty and Charlie's Angels. Last guy I want to talk about is a real wonderful actor, an actor named Brian Keith. And man, he is all over 40s and 50s film and 50s television and 60s television. He's a guy that really moved back and forth between the two mediums. Very imposing character. He can be a leading man. He can also be a bad guy. So I'm contending that of all the people I've talked about, he really kept a foot in both mediums throughout his career. But a lot of people will know him for being the single dad, single parent household in a television series of the 60s called Family Affair. And he had a butler. The actor was Sebastian Cabot that kind of looked after the kids. It's very interesting about those television shows about single parents. They were all fathers. They all had somebody in the house to take care of their kids, but they pulled it off. And it's kind of interesting how television got off on that tangent. I wonder what it was. I honestly don't know. I know Brian Keith's character in Family Affair was an engineer. I don't know what Robert Young's character was. I believe Fred MacMurray's character in My Three Sons was an aerospace engineer. But it's interesting, folks, all these television families. Today we would call them, upper middle class, but at the time they were solidly middle class. And with the exception of Brian Keith, they lived in that ranch house because they were filmed in Southern California. I believe the fictional location of these homes were probably ranch houses in Southern California, except for Brian Keith's character in Family Affair. He was kind of cool. He lived in a high rise in Manhattan, and he was always traveling the world. So a lot of the episodes were carried by Sebastian Cabot. So just to sum it up, these are actors that transitioned comfortably from film, where they had very successful careers, into this new, probably scary medium called television. And I contend they had no choice. The choice was, hey, listen, these great films like Double Indemnity, Rear Window, they're coming to an end or have come to an end. So it's either transition to television or try to make it in theater or hope a film comes along. But really, all the scripts were coming out of television. So you got to tip your hat to these actors, because I contend television was really good to Fred MacMurray. It elongated his career span. Raymond Burr, the same thing. Robert Young, the same thing. John Forsythe, the same thing. Of all of them, I'd say Brian Keith kept a foot in both television, film for his entire career. So that'll wrap it up. It just goes to show that in any industry, whatever you do outside of entertainment, you got to be prepared to pivot. You know, in this era of technological change and AI, everybody has to be prepared to pivot. And I contend in the next 5 years, you're going to see a lot of people. And I'm talking about doctors, lawyers, engineers, everybody doing a big pivot, because I contend that artificial intelligence is going to be doing a lot of the work that those folks are currently doing. And nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody can say it's going to be good or bad. I hope it's good. So go off, have a good weekend. Hey, listen, go watch some television with Fred MacMurray, Raymond Burr, Robert Young, John Forsythe, Brian Keith. See what they look like, see what they're doing. Contrast and compare with some of their movies, okay? It'll be really fun. You be the judge. Was television good to them or not? See a play, go to a museum, but be good to yourself. At the end of the day, nobody will be better to you than yourself. I bid you a fond adieu, and class is dismissed.
It's worth noting that when TV Guide released the 50 Greatest TV Dads, Robert Young and Fred MacMurray were 3 and 4, respectively. But then again, Homer Simpson was also on that list, so take it for what it was. You've been listening to the Razors Inc. podcast with Jonathan Farini. Be sure to check out Jonathan's collection of fiction at the Jonathan B. Farini Story Collection at jonathanfarini.com. There you'll find everything from drama to romance, something for every reader. That's jonathanfarini.com, Farini with 2 R's, 1 N. Or drop an email to razorsincpodcast@gmail.com.